Hi, I'm your host, Eunny Jang. Today on Knitting Daily, we're examining finishing techniques, those final steps at the end of the project that have a big effect on the final look. We get started with a seaming primer, from knit to invisible, and much more. So the first thing I want to do is just give you a really good, thorough instruction on how to seam your knitting. The most common seam that's used in knitting is called mattress stitch. I'm just going to thread my needle here. You always want to use a blunt tapestry needle like this one because you don't want to really be splitting your stitches most of the time when you're seaming your knitting. And this is called mattress stitch. It's a way of seaming rows of knitting, horizontal rows of knitting to horizontal rows of knitting. And it can be almost invisible when you're done. So I'm just going to show you here to start. And you can work mattress stitch in half a stitch in from the edge, seaming along this line. But usually I like to work at least one full stitch in from the edge. And what we're actually going to be stitching, I'm going to pull apart these columns of stitches here, and you can see these little ladders in between. That's actually what I'm going to be picking up to stitch. So I'm going to insert my needle and pick up one ladder and back out, staying in the same column of stitches. Now on the corresponding side, and usually when you're actually working on a garment, you'll want to have markers or pins or some other way to keep your pieces kind of aligned with each other. But for this sample, we don't need them. I'm going to pick up a corresponding ladder on the other piece here, and I'm just going to pull through. Now I'm going to go in the hole that the yarn came out of on the left-hand piece, pick up the next ladder, pull through, and you'll notice that I'm not pulling quite tight yet, and you'll see why in a minute. I'm going to pick up the next ladder on the right stitch, or on the right piece, pull through, and then again on the left. And now that I've got a few stitches going, I'm just going to pull a little bit tightly, and you can see that that's an almost completely invisible join, and if we'd use the same color, it would really be truly almost invisible. And on the back side, you've got this very neat one-stitch selvage here. This one stitch seam allowance right there. Moving on, sometimes you need to stitch stitches to stitches. You need to stitch a bound-off edge to a cast-on edge, or vice versa. Or it might be two bound-off edges, such as at the top of a shoulder. And to do that, this is pretty much a variation on the mattress stitch. Instead of picking up the bars between the stitches, though, I'm going to pick up an actual whole stitch like that. Both loops are on my needle. I'm going to pull through. I'm going to pick up two loops on the right-hand piece and pull through. Oops, get untangled there. Pick up the next two. Pull through, pick up the next two, and pull through. And when I pull it tight, again, it's almost invisible, although they are offset by half, and that will always be true when you're working stitches to stitches. You'll also need to sometimes stitch rows to stitches, stitches to rows. And when that's going on, you want to use the exact same action as you did before, but you'll want to occasionally pick up more rows than you would a stitch. You don't want to stitch one ladder to every row because row gauge and stitch gauge tend to be off. In that case, you'll usually want to pin your garment together first so that your knitting is always kind of aligned and you know that you got the right tension going. Then you can also use a back stitch, which is just the normal back stitch that you know from sewing. And in that case, it will be just like sewing. You'll put your right sides together, take a stitch through both layers of fabric, go back a bit, go midway between the two stitches, and come back up further on, then go back again, and come up forward, and so on. And that will give you a really strong stitch, although it may not be quite as invisible because you will inevitably go through stitches from time to time rather than sewing one stitch to one stitch really neatly. And then this is a seam that's really useful to know for things like the tops of shoulders where you need a lot of strength. And this is called a crocheted seam. You're going to take your crochet hook, which is about the same size as the needle that you were using for the actual knitted fabric, insert it through both layers of fabric at the edge, yarn over, and pull the yarn through both layers. Now we're going to go ahead and pick up another yarn by sticking the needle through both layers of fabric, yarn over, pull it through, and actually pull it through the stitch that's already on the hook. And I'll do that just one more time so you can actually see what's going on. You've got a neat little chain forming here, and on the right side, it's a very strong, sturdy seam. And if you take a look at some of the samples that I have, you can see how great seaming can really make a garment.